Okay, there we go. Here at Interfaith, we serve approximately 2,000 families a year. Last year during COVID, it was a little bit more than that. I want to tell you about two groups of folks that we serve in the first 6 months of our current fiscal year. So roughly the last 6 months, just over 100 families came to us in need of emergency rent assistance, and we provided that. So there are families who were at imminent risk of losing their housing. They were experiencing housing instability. Just over 100
we're all
in
doing
6 months.
So
the other group is
okay.
just over 100 people
Right.
who describe their housing situation as homeless or lacking a permanent address. Just over 100 people were experiencing homelessness. Generally, when among the folks that we work with who are experiencing homelessness, about half of them are doubled up. So they are staying with family and friends, they're sleeping on someone's living room floor, that kind of thing. So that's about half. Another quarter of them are generally staying at the local or the closest domestic violence shelter. And then another quarter of them are unhoused. So they are outside, they're in their cars, they are camping in the summer. So in total, just over 100 in the last 6 months. Housing instability and homelessness are traumas that can profoundly impact mental health and can cause individuals to develop skills that help them cope in the immediate but hinder movement toward long-term stability. We have two presenters with us today to help us understand better the intersection between homelessness, housing instability, and mental health. I'm going to tell you about those two. First, Steve Carlson. Steve holds a master's degree in counseling and psychology and public and nonprofit administration and a doctorate in clinical psychology. He's been working in mental health, chemical health, housing, and homeless response for over 30 years. His areas of interest and specialty include integrated mental and chemical health treatment, mindfulness and mental health, harm reduction, trauma-informed care, supportive housing, and the psychology of long-term homelessness. Steve is currently employed at the U of M as a clinical trainer at the Minnesota Center for Chemical and Mental Health and provides training and consultation to agencies around the state and nationally. Our second speaker will be Debbie Fink. Debbie is currently the Associate Program Manager for the Caring for Kids program here at Interfaith Outreach. Debbie holds a master's degree in clinical social work with a focus on maternal and children's mental health and family crisis intervention. Her background includes work in early childhood, including early childhood special education and children's developmental disabilities. Debbie is passionate about early intervention and supporting the whole family through a trauma-informed, person-centered, and holistic approach. Before I turn it over to our two speakers, I want to encourage you to share the questions that come up for you as they come up in chat. You won't distract our speakers. Deb Landy, who is our Director of Communication, is here on the call, and she will collect your questions as you put them in chat, and she'll do her best to theme them where that makes sense, so that when our speakers are done, she'll share those themes back to get the Q&A section of our conversation going. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Steve.
Thanks, Wendy. And so good to be with all of you today. Thank you for joining. I'm calling in from lovely Pine City, Minnesota, and it's a foggy day here as I hear it is there. So good to be with you all.
Mm-hmm.
I've had the privilege of working in the homeless field for many, many years. Now I primarily do training. And you can move on to the next slide, Wendy. And I recall when I first started back in the mid 90s, we had been developing some 10-year plans to end homelessness with a sense of hope that we would be able to end it. And we've made many, many gains in it, but I also see that we have quite a ways to go. I just want to say that no one sets out to become homeless. in life. Everyone wants a safe place to live and to be. The upper left-hand corner is a picture of Simpson Shelter in South Minneapolis. And I recall the first night that I was there and doing outreach to the shelter, I just looked around at a room full of people who were really struggling in life with many, many types of problems. We now have many people living in encampments, and you can see in the lower right-hand corner, there's a fellow that had gotten his own home in a big viaduct. And you probably can't see this, but there's even a set of golf clubs sitting outside his home there. We all define homelessness, or we all define a home differently. And some people would prefer to sleep outside and in camps where they might feel safer than on a mat in a floor in a homeless shelter. You can go to the next slide. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Castaway with Tom Hanks. It's actually a brilliant movie and a documentary on what is it like to actually become homeless. Tom Hanks here, this is his first day on the island. He was a FedEx executive and crashed in the ocean and landed about 500 miles away from the crash on a deserted island. And his name was Chuck Nolan, and he found himself homeless for the first time. You can go on to the next slide. His first night in the shelter, or his first night on the island, there's an image of him waking up in the middle of the night holding a stick because of hearing the sounds and the fear that had flooded his body for being, on this island with no idea how to escape. There's been a research study by Lisa Goodman who really takes a look at the impact for people who become homeless. And she identified two core symptoms of psychological trauma. Number one is a sense of social disaffiliation, where we feel a deep disconnection from our fellow human being. Most people on the pathway toward homelessness they start that journey by doing some couch hopping, what we call housing instability. And oftentimes will wear out their welcome and end up out on the streets for varieties of circumstances as to why. And there's this deep sense of feeling a disconnection from other humans. And over time, develops what we call is a sense of learned helplessness, where no matter what someone does, they feel like they cannot feel a sense of agency or empowerment to get out of that situation. And over time, people actually settle into a routine of being homeless. And next slide. I was teaching a class at Metropolitan State University several years ago on homelessness. And the first night of class, I brought a whole bunch of cardboard and markers and had all of my students create a sign that if they were to stand out on a street corner and hold up a sign, what would that sign say? At the end of the class, I told them that their assignment for next week was to take their sign and go stand on a street corner somewhere. Me feeling like this brilliant professor that I had this like really amazing project for them to do, I driving home, congratulating myself, and I realized that I had never done this myself. So I better do it. If I'm going to expect someone else to do it, I better try it. So I made a sign, and I stood in Bloomington on the exit ramp of 494 and Portland Avenue. You've probably driven it yourself, and stood on the street corner. And my plan was, I had a pocket full of $10 bills that if anyone stopped, I would simply, to give me money, I would give them $10, thank them for stopping, and basically say, God is good, pay it forward. I stood there for about a half an hour and didn't have any takers. And I can tell you that the first 10 minutes, as I observed people driving up and it was a hot July day. They drove up, air conditioning on, windows up, and nobody actually even looked at me. And I stood there within arm's distance of someone in their car, and I felt this incredible disconnection from my fellow human being. After a half an hour, I actually began to become so discouraged about my own life and who I was, and feeling like just like a piece of trash along the side of the road. I decided that was enough for me. It was beginning to already affect my mental health. So I started to leave the corner, and this young woman comes walking up, waving a dollar bill, saying, sir, I have $1 for you. And I immediately felt this sense of being reconnected to my fellow human being. And I just thanked her for offering me $1. I gave her $10 and said, thank you for stopping and offering that. I don't need the money. Here's $10. God is good. And she throws her arms up and says, God is great. and we parted, but I was so grateful that I had someone that actually reached out to me and offered me. It really didn't matter that she had money for me. It's that she made a connection with me. Next slide, Wendy. So there's a fellow, Basil Vanderkolk, who wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score. He's a researcher on trauma. And he wrote that trauma occurs when one loses the sense of having a safe place to retreat within or outside oneself to deal with frightening emotions or experiences. We all need a safe place, both inside ourselves, and whether it's in a viaduct or it's in an encampment or it's in an apartment or our homes, we all need a place to be able to feel a sense of safety. And when we don't, it takes an incredible toll on our own mental health. Next slide. And what we end up entering into, it's called survival mode. And it's when our amygdala, this little almond-shaped organ in our brain that is our fight and or flight or freeze organ that helps us to survive, is that we enter into a way of being that has complete short-term goals. We aren't thinking of long-term goals. We're just thinking about, how do I survive today? And this takes an incredible toll on our bodies as well. Next slide. There is a book that was written, you can see it on the last bullet point, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Be thinking about that question, why zebras don't get ulcers. When someone enters into an unsafe environment, including a lack of home or a lack of place to feel safe in, is that what happens is that our body begins to have our stress response system gets triggered. And when that happens, powerful chemicals enter our system, including like cortisol and adrenaline, and those fill our system up, getting ready for fight or flight response. There's also a lot of hormones and steroids and other things. And what happens is that we no longer are in need of using our digestive system or our immune system or our sexual reproductive system. And so energy does not go to those systems, but they go to how we might be able to run away, how we might be able to fight, our systems around physiology so that we can run fast, or to our muscular systems. And those become the primary place that all of these chemicals go to. Over time, however, what we call chronic hyperarousal is that it takes a toll on our mental health, our physical health, and we literally live about 20 or 30 years shorter lives when we are in a position of experiencing this chronic hyperarousal. So the book that is written by Robert Sampolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers is because the way that zebras, they're brilliant. I mean, when a lion comes along, out in the wild, if there's a lion that's, or a group of lions that are there to attack them, their stress response system kicks in, giving them plenty of energy and strength to run away or kick or whatever. And when the lion is no longer there, either they were eaten or they weren't eaten. And when the lions are no longer there, if they've gotten away, suddenly their stress response system stops and they go back to grazing and they're very calm. But when we live in homelessness, this stress response system begins to take over and it continues to impact our systems in our body chronically and having significant impact. Next slide, Wendy. And so we learn the ropes of homelessness and we begin to develop these survival skills that we begin to wrap our lives around. And this happens both when we are in precariously housed or have housing instability, or when we are literally homeless. In the movie, Tom Hanks or Chuck Nolan developed some really, really good survival skills. If you recall, as you saw, he developed a relationship with this soccer ball or volleyball, I'm not sure which it was, called it Wilson, and developed an affiliation because of this need for having a relationship. Part of, one of the things that we do in prisons is that we will lock people up into isolation or into solitary confinement as a punishment. People literally within a matter of days, and if it's weeks or a month, begins to actually become psychotic and begin to develop delusions, imaginations, and can actually literally develop a mental illness through solitary confinement. So there are adaptive skills and there's maladaptive skills. Using alcohol and drugs is a maladaptive skill, but it's very effective in dealing with the pain, the struggle, the challenges of being homeless. Not recommended, but it is a tool that people use to be able to anesthetize the pain. Next slide, please. So not only this, but you compound it with what somebody grew up with. There's a thing called the ACEs study. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And Kaiser Permanente, along with the Center for Disease Control, studied 18,000 records of medical patients and identified what types of health problems they had, chronic health problems, mental health problems, people that smoked and did other kinds of alcoholism and drug addiction. And they correlated that with the number of adverse childhood experiences that they had in their life. People that live homeless are oftentimes 46% of homeless adults, as you can see from this slide, have 3 or more ACEs, which is almost off the charts as far as the number of adverse childhood experiences. Amongst the general population, about 10% have 3 or more ACEs. Also, individuals that end up homeless have had a difficult start in life, meaning that they perhaps were institutionalized in the foster care system or juvenile justice system. They may have been in special education or dropped out of school, or they gave birth to a child before the age of 18. Next slide, please. So here's the thing, is that if you didn't have a psychiatric disability before you became homeless, there's a good chance a person will develop one because of this. I remember several years ago, I worked with a young man. He had driven up from Iowa. Actually, I think he took a bus up from Iowa. He lived with his grandparents because his parents, through some family challenges, or maybe they passed away, but he grew up with his grandparents and things were not going well. And so he decided to come up to Minneapolis. The housing program that I was operating required that somebody have a serious mental illness in order to come into my program. It was just part of the federal government's HUD program that funded my program. And I remember meeting with him, and as a psychologist, I could assess whether or not he had a mental illness or not. And at that time, he did not. And so he was not eligible for my program. And so he lived in the shelter system and tried to find work and maybe had a job periodically. But I remember running into him about 2 years later. And literally, after living homeless for that long, he had developed many, many signs of a serious mental illness and actually became eligible for my program, which is very, very sad that it took him developing a mental illness in order to become into my program. Go ahead, and next slide, please. And again, if you saw the movie Castaway, after 4 years of living on the island, you could clearly see the impact that this had on Chuck Nolan and his mental health. He literally began to have delusions, hallucinations, and the impact of living homeless for him on this island had a serious kind of impact on his system. And there's one more slide, I think. And he finally was able to get off of the island because what showed up was part of a small, it's an outhouse or it was something from Bakersfield. And he was able to develop a rig to get off of the island. And then, but one of the things that kept him going is that his fiance, Kelly Frears, he had a stopwatch that she had given him on the last night that he had seen them before he went and took the flight that crashed. And that's the thing that kept him going, is that sense of connection to another human being, and was the impetus that led him to be able to get to back off of the island. And I think that's my last slide. So in concluding, the key here that I'm wanting to point out is this importance of human connection with each other, people that are living homeless, and how do we stay connected to them to support each other in our mental health and our chemical health as well. I think that must be it for me, Wendy.
Yep. Thank you so much. We'll turn it over to Debbie now before questions.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Steve. It's good to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you about the intersection of mental health and children's mental health and homelessness. So to look at this homeless study from Wilder, and this Steve presented a few stats on this as well, but I think it's important to look at just to get an idea of where we are now and where we need to go. And it'll also lend some insight into patterns that we're going to talk about later on here. So every 3 years, Wilder does this study on the state of homelessness in Minnesota, and 2018 was the most recent one. And so some stats that I want to pay attention to in that study that's impacting kids is that 77% of homeless adults have had multiple experiences with homelessness. So Steve also shared that, and many of them had those repeated experiences from an early age. And 73% had at least one of those adverse childhood experiences. And then in that study, they found that 32% of those experiencing homelessness were children living with their parents. So you can go to the next slide. So why is that important? And how might that be showing up for kids in the community? If 32% of those experiencing homelessness are kids, that's a large number. And children are the ones that are often bearing the brunt of that impact of homelessness. So kids experiencing homelessness aren't just experiencing that homelessness, as Steve touched on too. They are experiencing multiple impacts and other risk factors from that experience. So kids who are homeless, they're more likely to have emotional problems as preschoolers, repeat a grade, have learning disabilities. They're also more likely to experience assault, witness violence, experience hunger. They become sick at twice the rate of other children, have 4 times the rate of asthma, and 5 times more likely to suffer from stomach problems. Go to the next slide. So all those experiences and those ACEs and those traumatic events, those have lasting impacts on children and their brain development. So Alan Schroff, he is a researcher from Minnesota. Him and his team began a longitudinal study starting in the 1970s, where they looked at attachment and they documented the role of caregiving in shaping patterns of attachment and the capacity of infant attachment patterns to predict later social competence and mental health. So he followed a group of kids and infants starting from birth through infancy, through school age, through adolescence, early childhood, And now those group of infants are in their own adulthood years and parenthood years. So to sum up the extensive findings through that 40-year study, as simply as possible, is they found that all of our developmental history always stays with us and will always be with us. And the development stages build on one another. And that chronic early stress can predict the behaviors of 2-year-olds, can predict the behaviors that they'll have in their school age years, and predict their behaviors and mental health into adulthood. So they found that, sure enough, you can predict that from infancy. And that boils down to attachment. And those with secure attachment and their secure attachment with caregivers or someone in their life, they're more likely to handle stress well. And stress in family, it correlates with the problems that children may have. So as stress in the family goes up, then the stress of the kid, the behaviors of the child, their learning abilities, those are all going to be impacted, and you're going to see an increase in behaviors. But as stress goes down and parents are able to be more present, then children's behaviors improve. And so children, what they need for that secure attachment is emotional warmth, consistency, and clear and firm support. And under stress, it's valid that parents just cannot provide that if they're experiencing that high level of stress from all those experiences of homelessness that we've talked about. And as each stage goes on, it becomes more and more difficult, and those behaviors become more and more difficult to intervene. And so a supportive relationship is a predictor for success in children's lives. So we may see children who are under a lot of stress and not have behaviors or have really minimal behaviors, and that is due to them having a secure attachment in their life. So you can go to the next slide. Ann Garrity, she is also she's a clinical social worker from Minnesota, and she developed something called the developmental repair model. She is with Washburn, and she confirms that children's mental health is impacted by the mental health of parents. And so she describes some of those most damaging risk factors as being disruption in primary care, inadequate care, violence, family experiences such as chronic homelessness, poverty, unemployment, mental or physical illness, drug use, sudden loss, uncertainty, learning obstacles, and all of those can fit under the umbrella of homelessness. So when someone's experiencing homelessness and families are experiencing homelessness, all of those can easily come with that. And those are all the highest risk factors for kids and their emotional development and mental health development, being able to be kindergarten ready and be successful in school. All of those have really high risks on kids. So in her developmental repair model, she strives to help us understand that a young child's behaviors are not a result of the kid being a bad, quote unquote, kid and needing discipline and needing punishments, and how we can avoid that label, and how it's crucial to avoid that label and instead ask the question, what has happened to you to cause this reaction or cause this behavior? And this is so important for intervening and creating secure attachments because kids need regulation partners. So when a child's behavior and a young kid's behavior, when they're just trying to figure themselves out, trying to figure out how to cope, when their behaviors are going up like this, they need someone that's going to be that regulation partner for them. So to bring them back down and bring them back to security. And when they don't have that, their brains stay in a constant state of stress. And that is what wreaks the most havoc on the brain development and that early childhood development. And it's the ages of 0 to 5 that kids' brains are developing the quickest, the most rapidly. And so crucial to help kids learn those coping skills and bring them back to security so their brains aren't living in that state of stress. And like Steve described with trauma and how that trauma impacts the brain, it's so damaging for kids to experience that in the 0 to 5 age when their brains are developing. So they need those regulation partners, people to help them cope, learn how to cope, what our healthy coping mechanisms look like. But when their parents are also under that same amount of high stress, it's so hard for the brain to think rationally and critically. And so when kids' behaviors go like this, parents' behaviors go like this, and they can easily match the children's behaviors and the children's mood, which creates a really hard time for kids to cope. And so Ann Garrity, she describes those negative behaviors that we see in kids as just a hard time coping and inadequate tools for coping. And that's why we see those. And when kids don't have that, they grew up to be adults with negative attachment patterns, impacting their decision-making and their own ability to form healthy attachments if they don't have that attachment in that young age. So Wendy, you can go to the next slide. So what are the risks here if we don't intervene? There's a lot, as we can see. So we are just putting the mental health of our littlest community members at risk and putting them at a major risk for continuing that cycle of homelessness. There was another study that found that 93% of mothers experiencing homelessness experienced homelessness themselves as kids. 93%. That is a really unbelievable number. And so we are just putting kids at risk for getting stuck in that decision-making that makes life difficult. And the earlier we can do, the better, because as Alan Stroke said and points out, each stage of development builds on one another. And it starts at birth, but it also starts in the womb. So as early as we can intervene with families, the more likely kids can avoid that mental illness later on in life. And the statistics are clear that, as we can see, that early disruption in that development and that stress in families plays a big role. That rapid change in homelessness that happens, uncertainty, lack of security, are all experiences that are incredibly, incredibly stressful on kids and their caregivers. And why it becomes so vital to support people in lowering that stress. So as we talked about a minute ago, you know, when that stress is lowered, parents can be more present and kids can be more successful. So it's so vital to support people in lowering that stress so that families can stabilize, kids can stabilize, strengthen, and thrive and get to that place where we're not continuing that cycle and we can really disrupt that cycle of homelessness for kids to avoid those mental illnesses, physical illnesses later on in life. So that's what I got for you on the impact of mental health in a really brief overview way. I highly recommend looking at Ann Garrity's developmental repair model. If you get a chance, if you've never seen it before, it is very interesting and gives a lot of great tools for helping anyone that's working with kids be that regulation partner, because it doesn't have to be the caregiver. It's ideal if it is, but it can be anyone in the community that is being that regulation partner for kids. So thank you so much, everyone. Deb, I think you've been recording some questions that have come through. So I would love to hear what those are.
Well, absolutely. And thank you both. An incredible amount of information. Appreciate it. There have not been any questions in the chat, so I'm going to generate a few here. And please continue to keep them coming. If you have them in your head, go ahead and drop them in there. One thing I would ask, Steve, would you please expound on, you talked about adaptive skills versus maladaptive skills, and you gave us a couple examples of maladaptive. Could you give us some examples of adaptive skills that have helped individuals that you have worked with who were struggling with chronic hyperarousal of that stress?
Yeah. We used to, thanks, Deb, we used to, 50, 60, 80 years ago, many people didn't even brush their teeth. That hygiene around brushing teeth, and then you know, 30 or 40 years ago, if somebody was out running and we asked them, what are you running from? And they may have just been out exercising. We were just like, why exercise? Well, now if these have become just regular parts of our lives. Another area that's becoming a public health pattern is, how do we practice mindfulness and a sense of self-awareness? And the quality of being able to practice mindfulness and observing ourselves and observe what we're doing so that we can observe negative thoughts or positive thoughts is an incredibly adaptive skill. There's a research at the University of Wisconsin on healthy brains. And healthy brains are ones that can practice a sense of awareness, which comes through practicing literally meditation and mindfulness practices. So that's one really helpful thing, is the ability to pause and reflect on what's happening, which is kind of what Debbie was saying. We want to provide those kinds of skills to our kids to be able to observe what's happening and regulate their own emotional reaction. And so regulating our emotions, or what Daniel Goleman referred to as emotional intelligence in his research from the 90s. And now we all just begin to practice a sense of emotional regulation and knowing, why am I mad and what do I do with my anger? But other ones include social skills, the ability to be able to talk to a case manager or an advocate, how to advocate for oneself, and learning the skill and tool of advocating for oneself. And this takes practice. Many maladaptive skills are avoiding situations, avoiding taking personal responsibility. And this isn't to shame people into responsibility. This is to empower people into, think of the word, the ability to respond, or responsibility. We want to support people in developing tools like being able to take the necessary action.
Thank you so much, Steve. That is spot on. I appreciate that, especially the connection to case managers and such, which is a skill and a staffing program that we have here. Martha asks us, can you suggest early childhood development organizations that address these homelessness problems? I think that might be more for you, Debbie and/or Wendy, but open to all three.
I think, go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah, good question. I think it's a multifaceted issue because, like we said, homelessness impacts the mental health. So there's a lot of organizations that focus just on mental health or just on homelessness. I do know Washburn is a really great resource that focuses on holistic family approaches and looking at that whole picture. And, here at Interfaith, we have our Caring for Kids program that I'm a part of, where we do support families in that holistic way too, with trying to get out of homelessness, but also supporting their children in being successful and being kindergarten ready. I would have to look into some more if there's other ones out there that are addressing those different needs in one organization, one picture. But I do know Washburn is the most well-known for addressing that right now.
I think I would just add that, over a number of years, the folks who are doing homeless response and running shelters, you see a lot more children's programming in shelters nowadays, because there's such a recognition of the trauma that those kids are going through. And so, I'm looking at staff who have done this work in the past, that there really is a focus on the whole family now, more so than there was years ago.
Yeah, that's very true.
Thank you. And then Charlene asks, what can the faith community do to create spaces for families who are in high stress situations? Can we create evening connections, free daycare, friendship circles for moms? What kind of things maybe are happening in our community, and what more might be needed?
I think that's a really great question. And when I saw that come through in the chat, I was just thinking about our hierarchy of needs and how those basic needs really need to be met before the next ones can be met. So I think just creating a safe space for people to ask for help and, coming together to support families in those tangible needs. And I think some of those ideas, like having those evening connections or friendships for moms, those are great ways to create that safety and that feeling of safety to ask for that help and building that type of relationship. So I'd say whatever you can do to really build that safe relationship first, and then help meet those basic needs so the family can start thinking about the next steps and being able to be more present with their family.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then John asks, how do we think COVID has impacted children under the age of 5?
Really good question, and something we've been seeing come through a lot. I know that it's had a massive impact on development, and as they're doing screenings for kids, the early childhood screenings, they're seeing that kids are developmentally more behind than they've ever been. And so they're seeing that kids aren't getting potty trained at the same stage that they normally are, and social skills are further behind. So they're having to adapt for that And so when we see social skills behind and developmental skills behind, we know that the mental health is being impacted. And that's what they've been seeing, especially here in Wayzata. I've been talking closely with them to see what are the trends in our Wayzata community and as kids are getting screened for kindergarten. And that's what they're saying is they're having to adjust those screenings because there's so many kids that are behind that they've now reevaluated how they're doing their screenings. So it's had a massive impact on those kids. Steve, would you say anything else? Or Wendy, would you say anything else?
It might be worth noting, Debbie, the survey that the school just recently did of families and the kind of response they got about mental health. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, so Wayzata sent out a survey to all families in the district with kids, and just surveying about mental health and what the mental health needs are. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was a very high number of responses back for families asking for support and recognizing through answering the survey that their kids may be struggling with their own mental health. And so they have a relate person on site and they have more mental health on site to respond to that need. So it's a very high response rate for that.
It's a really good question.
Thank you. The next question is for Steve. So Steve, based on your story of sort of standing by the side of the road and experiencing that energy of disconnection, what would you advise that individuals in our community do? Stop, make eye contact, roll your window down, even if you're not going to give money, do you, say a prayer, like, we're thinking about you, our thoughts are with you. What would you suggest?
It's such a great question. It's a moral dilemma when we drive up and someone's standing there asking us for money. And what do we do? What is the responsible thing to do? And so first and foremost, yes, a social connection. I don't think we need to necessarily give money or give socks or give a bottle of water or an apple or something. These may be things that you do. But there's lots of different responses. I recall this was a few years ago. I was driving to my sister's in Lakeville, and I took the exit onto County Road 50 off of 35W, heading south. And I was going to be heading out to a friend of mine's to cut some logs. It was winter. I mean, it was snow out, and I was going to be cutting logs with my chainsaw. And I could use some help. So I rolled my window down and said to the fellow, do you want to work for a few hours? He said, sure. And I said, well, hop in. I don't recommend all of you doing this, but it just worked for me. And I said, hop in. And we drove out to my friend's house out south of Lakeville. And he helped me load up my trailer with logs as I used my chainsaw. And then I brought him back to Apple Valley, where he was staying in one of those pay for stay places. He had lost his home down in Jordan, where he was working in a body shop, but he had lost that job, and so he was staying with his daughter and her boyfriend, who were also homeless, pooling their money in a pay for stay place. And so I had a chance to hear his story and just provide some kind of support. Obviously, I paid him, gave him $50 or $60 or something like that for helping me. But it was the social connection to me that really mattered, that he was cared about. But I will always roll down my window if I have a chance and just say, how you doing? It's a warm day, or, and sometimes I give money, sometimes I give something else, but it's something that we all have to sort out what to do based on our own safety, our own felt sense of what's the right thing for me to do.
Thank you, Steve. Really appreciate that. We have another question from Christopher asking, do we have any ideas of how we can begin to work with homeless individuals in our community? Currently, Christopher's working with 4 different people living outdoors in shelters. How do they triage those for help, get them food, blankets, clothing? And really, what are our options in the Plymouth, Wayzata, Orono area? There's no shelters really out here for families in general, besides the domestic violence shelter. So Wendy, do you have any sense of that local like impact or?
How to respond to folks who are experiencing homelessness. That's true. We don't have shelters near us, but we are in Hennepin County, and Hennepin County has a shelter system. Those shelters are, most of them are downtown. We have several staff on our team who play the role of housing coaches, which part of what they do is when folks are needing to access shelter, it's their job to kind of know how to get there quickly, just what the right number is and where to go. And the shelters in Hennepin County are really well organized. So if somebody wanted to come here and get some information about how to access shelter, we could get that for them pretty quickly. The question about how to get basic needs items to folks, I guess I would say that I don't know what agency Christopher works at. Here, we do have items that we can provide. We can help people with food that you don't need a kitchen, clothes, blankets, can openers, and things like that. So if we can be a resource, we're happy to do that. Steve, did you have anything else that you wanted to?
Yeah, what I wanted to just say is really based on some work by Stephen Covey. He wrote a book talking about the circle of control, or the circle of control, circle of concern, and circle of influence that we have. And one of the things that happens is that we see things going on. We see people that are homeless, and we feel this sense of wanting to do something. And with media and everything else, our circle of concern gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But really, the circle of influence and circle of control is fairly small. And that, Christopher, that you are doing something for 4 families is just admirable. Is that if there is one small thing that we have a circle of control over and circle of influence, part of our circle of influence is educating our family members and community members about the nature of homelessness, that it's much more about a lack of affordable housing and our systemic structures than it is personal moral failure. And educating each other on that is really, really helpful. And that can be our circle of influence. But if we can just take the small area that we have control over and seek to make an impact there. I don't have an idea around the resources, but there are small opportunities that we have to be able to make a difference.
Deb, can I just chime in here?
Please.
Yeah.
Christopher here. I'm with We Can out in Mound. So working a lot with IOCP and all of you. So we're just seeing this is definitely growing, the number that we're seeing. And so part of my question is, what do we tell volunteers? Because you have this sense of wanting to help, but not knowing how. So then, we have one of these individuals, a partner has housed them in a hotel for a week and a half, and a volunteer is doing that. So there's all sorts of red flags popping up here on how is this happening?
Mm-hmm.
Then, I know there are hotel programs to help people get through weekends and things like that. So I would love to work with partner churches and with IUCP to just think about these short-term options to help these folks, and then to help our volunteers too, who we want to be giving them good information of how they can help in the best ways.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that. Christopher, Station, what I would say is that we try to, as much as we can, get people to shelters because there's services attached to those shelters that we can't provide if we're getting folks in, we're putting them in a hotel or something. That's not a long-term support for them. And there's access to some housing programs that they can get if they get into shelter. I know that many are not up for that all the time, but that is what we try to do. Other than that, I'm happy to sit and talk with you a little bit more about this. It definitely is growing. It sounds like it's growing in your area as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. And we try to do the same, but as you know, there are some people who have either been in the shelters and won't go, they literally will not go back. They will sleep outside
Yeah.
go to a shelter. So that's where we're in these really tough situations. And then you've got city officials who, don't want them sleeping in the parking garage and all sorts of dynamics that then kick into play. So
Mhm.
it's really, we need to get a lot of different players together to get these solutions.
Well, and that's a great segue, Christopher, to the next question that somebody's asking. Should we talk about advocacy and what do we tell our city council members and et cetera? And we do have a thank you email for attending this event coming out soon, right after. And we do talk about advocating for, different ways to do that. So please watch for that email, and there will be some resources there in that email.
Mhm.
Wendy, Debbie, do you want to add anything more, or do you just want to kind of have them watch for that email with those resources?
I think that that's good, that the email will go out. I will add that, Interfaith is affiliated with a development group called Outreach Development Corporation. I think LaDonna is here on the call today. She's involved in that. One of the areas of focus that that group has is advocacy. And so they're the ones who are really having conversations with the HRAs and the cities and thinking about policies and planning. And so that's a group that it might make sense to connect with. And maybe we could add that goes out. Debbie.
Yep,
Or
you
Deb.
can add that link before that email goes out. Absolutely. Sounds good.
Yep.
And then one more question about the school systems having access to the wealth of info that we've shared here in the ACEs study. Can you talk a little bit about the, are teachers clear and or being trained on the factors that young people are experiencing?
A really good question. I'm not sure the level of training teachers are getting. So if someone does, that would be awesome. But I do know it is more and more research is coming out about that early childhood and that behavior age and what happens at each stage of development for kids and why we see the behaviors that we do. So I do know it is more recent in terms of information. And so I really hope that it is training that teachers can begin to get. And I know school social workers, I think, are working hard at helping teachers understand this and understand kids' behaviors to keep kids in the classroom as much as possible, keep kids in their daycares and all of that. So I really hope that soon we can get more in education because I think that's crucial. So that's a really good question.
Wonderful.
I can jump in really quickly. I'm Julie Jurek, and I'm the school social worker for Orono, the K-5 school social worker. We have been doing some ACEs training over the last 5 years that have been, it started with us going to Interfaith, a small group of us, and watching the video there and having the training that occurred there. And then we have trained our staff, I would say in a fairly, all staff K-12 in a fairly broad overview, but then our special education staff and our mental health staff have had a deeper dive with the ACEs training and guest speakers and professional development days and stuff. So I feel like we're off to a really good start with that.
Thank you so much. That's so good to hear.
Wonderful. And then I think we have time for one more question. And I am going to, let's see, I think a lot of the others are comments. So I'm going to just sort of say, Virginia, do you want to speak into the room about which survey you were hoping that we could add to our plethora of resources that we are providing?
Yes, hi. I was just wondering about the survey that Debbie was referring to, just for what we're trying to do with Partners in Prevention and such. Just want to get maybe a better temperature on what's going on. I mean, we've got some surveys from just the high school students, but we don't really have a community-wide way to kind of hone in on a few more things that are going on.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not sure how they're sharing out the surveys and with the data they collected, but I can definitely ask about that and see if that's something that they can share out.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And to be clear, that would not be in the email that's following this, because that would not be too quick. That's too quick to do that. But Debbie will look into that and
Yeah.
see how we can get that available.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. And then I think we will go ahead and do a wrap up. We've got about 3 minutes left. So Wendy, I will turn it back to you.
Thank you, and I'll send it to Adam.
Thank you both. And so I just want to mention a couple of things before we end the conversation. First of all, thank you to everyone just attending and, hearing some of the things that were shared today. Thank you so much, Steve and Debbie and Wendy, for lending your expertise and wisdom. And thank you I know there are many partners on this call dedicated to helping us address this issue. So thank you to you guys. I know we have a lot of donors on the call. So thank you for just really helping jump in and be a part of the solution. This community conversation we do is kind of connected to our broader Sleep Out campaign. And really one of the goals in that this campaign was started 26 years ago was to raise awareness around the issues of homelessness, but also to raise money to help us, provide, things like emergency assistance to either help people that are in homelessness or that are facing homelessness. So thank you for that. I will share that we have a very ambitious $3 million campaign goal. We're at 2.4 million. So we're getting there. And, if you want to get involved or donate, you can go to our website, iocp.org. The last thing I'll just share is we will follow up from this call. We'll get an email out with some of the resources and ways to get more involved. And of course, if we didn't address some of those things in the email, or if you have other questions, feel free to respond to that email. Many of you got a reminder email from me. You can also just reach out to me directly, and would love to follow up with you. Otherwise, thank you again for attending and being part of the work that we do here at Interfaith and in our larger community.
Thank you, Adam. I think with that, we'll close. Everyone, enjoy the day. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, everyone.